You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. 25,000 people in the European Union die because their body cannot reject a serious bacterial infection with antibiotics. England's chief medical officer has come out and said the threat antibiotic-resistant bacteria poses is as great a threat to the UK as terrorism. Professor Dame Sally Davies described it as a ticking time bomb and has called for urgent action worldwide to tackle the issue. But antibiotic resistance was the focus on World Health Day in 2011 in Moscow. So what's being done now to fight drug-resistant bacteria? To discuss the issue, I'm joined by Professor Mark Fielder, Director of Medical Veterinary and Food Microbiology at Kingston University, Hugh Pennington, Emeritus Professor of Bacteriology at Aberdeen University, Nick Breton, Head of Research for Benenden Healthcare, a private healthcare service. I'll begin by asking Professor Mark Fielder in the studio here, why has it taken until 2013 for this message to get through again? And is Dame Sally Davies right to put it out there as big a threat as terrorism is?
It is a big a threat as terrorism because we don't exactly know when the next resistance problem is going to occur. We know that a resistance problem will occur, but exactly when and where is somewhat a mystery. So therefore, it's like terrorism in the sense that we know it's there, we just don't know exactly where it is. One of the problems we've got, certainly with modern medicine, is that we are very, very used to being able to be treated for infectious diseases. So there is an expectation on part of the medical fraternity to be able to treat, and us as the populace to be treated. So taking that together, I think what we've got here is a situation where we always hoped and thought it would carry on, and our treatments would just get better. What we've had to realise is that as treatments have been more rapidly and more readily used, we're now in a situation where resistance has occurred, and we really need to deal with it now. It's in our faces, so as to speak.
Professor Pennington, we'll deal then with what Dame Sally Davies has said, and then I'll come on to asking you how bacteria has become so clever.
Yes, Dame Sally Davies is right that we in the past we have got a resistant bacterium appearing, and then we've been able to throw a new antibiotic at it and sort the problem out. The trouble is that response runs out itself because the bacteria then get resistant to the next antibiotics. And, the worry is that sooner or later, and as Dame Sally Davies has been saying, we may run out of antibiotics altogether, at least for some bugs. Different bugs behave in different ways, but some get resistance very quickly, some take a longer time. Most of them do get resistant eventually. But the problem about developing new antibiotics, as she says in her big report that came out a week or two back, was that it's really quite difficult, and there are two big reasons for that. And she focuses on one, which is it's not actually terribly good business for the big pharmaceutical companies to have antibiotics as a mainstream because people get cured and they don't take the antibiotics for very long. They get better after a week or a fortnight. And so, unlike, say, medicines against blood pressure and insulin for diabetics and so on, where you have to take them for many years, maybe for the rest of your life, looking purely from a business point of view, it's not sound. And of course, they're very expensive to develop. And also, we've run out of all the easy targets that we can hit in the bacteria that antibiotics have traditionally worked against. So they're going to be more difficult to find new antibiotics that work by different ways, to which bacteria are not already resistant, and the commercial side of it is not a very good one, and that's why I think she's proposing that, and already there are moves to help the pharmaceutical industry in the sense of taking bigger risks, because it's a very big risk. They may not actually come up with an antibiotic, and if they do, it's not going to make a lot of money.
OK, I'm just going to return to Professor Mark Fielder in the studio, but then I will come to you, Nick Breton. So, Mark.
I think what Professor Pennington says is absolutely true, but I think there's another thing we need to add on to that as well, and that's that we can't just pull a new antibiotic out of the bag. Even if we do identify an ever-diminishing target, as Professor Pennington says, it's still going to take 15 years or so, around that time, to get from the experimental bench to the marketplace, and we have to factor that in because the organisms are evolving much more quickly than that.
Nick Breton from the Benenden Healthcare. What's your reaction to Dame Sally Davies's comments?
We have a particular interest in the health and well-being of the population and of our members in particular. We are a mutual health and well-being provider with members around the country. So, but I just wish to emphasise that I am a layperson. So, as a healthcare society, we are very interested in this. We actually had a series of what we called big debate articles in our member magazine last year, in which we were looking at the ticking time bomb of increasing resistance to antibiotics. And I very much concur with what has been said so far about the concern that we should all have about this. We've seen in the population an overuse of existing antibiotics. We've seen there's been an increasing expectation on the part of patients to be prescribed antibiotics, and even misuse of antibiotics to treat things for which they wouldn't be effective, for instance, colds and so on. And we are concerned about the increasingly easy access to antibiotics over the counter in some countries where controls are less so than they are in the UK. And, of course, the use of antibiotics with livestock as well. So there are a number of fronts on which we are concerned, and we would love to see action on any or all of these.
As a layperson's perspective then, and the letters that you receive or the articles that you publish, who do you blame? Is it the doctors handing out too many antibiotics? Or, is it people not fulfilling their course? Or is it other countries who have a far more liberal approach to over-the-counter drugs?
Yes.
And those people are then in this sort of global world that we live in, travelling in between countries and spreading bacteria?
Yes, well, look, you pointed to sort of 4 or 5 factors there, all of which I believe contribute to the problems which we face. There are patients who, almost as a knee-jerk reaction, will expect and will press their GPs to give them antibiotics, for a quick fix. We know that the history that antibiotics has had in curing illnesses in the past, penicillin as well, has been tremendous. But that has led us, I believe, to an over-reliance and an over-prescription of those over the decades. And you have pointed also to perhaps different nations now making antibiotics more readily available, and a lack of funding, which has been mentioned, perhaps a lack of interest in developing new strains of antibiotics on the part of pharmaceuticals. So it is a combination of factors. If blame is to be apportioned, it's across an awful lot of fronts, not just one or two.
Thank you, Nick Breton, Head of Research at Benenden Healthcare. Now, Professor Mark Fielder, would you agree with the sort of broad approach that actually everyone is to blame in some way? Or you mentioned earlier about there being a 15-20-year gap of research. Would you expand on that?
Yeah, I think to take your first point, yes, it is a broad brush problem. We are, as a population, are expecting to be treated, and we are putting our healthcare professionals under pressure. They perhaps shouldn't buckle to that pressure, but sometimes they do. We also, I don't think we can underestimate the problem we've got abroad, where you can go into certain countries and buy a single antibiotic, not a course, a single drug. People take that, and it's been shown in various reports that people can take that to alleviate a problem almost immediately, but that does actually no good at all. You're given a 5 or 7 day course for a reason, and that's to get the whole life cycle of the microorganism in you. Once you've done that, you then will hopefully be clear of that organism. If you don't take the full course, or indeed just very worryingly take one antibiotic, you are not going to necessarily kill that organism. You may what we term as sublethally damage it. That means you damage the organism but don't kill it. The reparation process that organism then goes through may allow it to make a mistake in its genetic code, which may lead the organism to actually develop a mutation that doesn't do anything for the organism still dies. That's fine, that's not a problem. But the worrying thing is it might also allow that mutation to develop that does do something for the organism, that renders it resistant against the antibiotic, and that's then when we have a problem, because then that organism is surviving in an environment where antibiotics are present. It has a competitive advantage over all of the other organisms, and it can become what we term as clonally dominant. That's to say, that is the most common organism within the environment. And that is when you start to have a real problem with resistance. That's what we're starting to see now. In fact, some of the resistance patterns we're seeing coming into various parts of the world, such as the carbapenemase resistance and
can you explain what that exactly is?
Carbapenem is an antibiotic, and the carbapenemase is an enzyme that, or a chemical moiety in the organism that breaks down that antibiotic and means the organism becomes resistant to it. There's other ones called metalloproteinases which act in a very similar way, and they have also been identified, specifically NDM1, which is a marker that we look for, which we know is coming from other countries and possibly countries where this sort of misuse of antibiotics takes place.
Yes, could I come in here and just emphasise how important it is for us to realise that...
Yes, Professor Peddington.
Yes, the bacteria evolve in real time. They evolve very fast. In fact, a patient can be treated with a particular antibiotic, with some particular kinds of antibiotic, and the bug can get resistant to it while that patient is being treated. Sometimes it takes a bit longer than that for the resistant mutants to develop and spread. But remember, Alexander Fleming, who discovered penicillin, he was finding bacteria that were resistant to penicillin before penicillin had actually been used on a large scale, before it was commercially available. In the 1943, he found penicillin-resistant bacteria, resistant by the same mechanism that we just heard about, producing an enzyme that destroys penicillin. Then we made other types of antibiotic which were not destroyed by it, but then the Staphylococcus, which was the bug that Alexander Fleming used when he was discovering penicillin, became resistant to that as well, and they're called MRSA, and they spread around the world. So that's right. This is and of course, bacteria can divide very quickly, the fastest every 20 minutes. You know, a new parent gives rise to daughter bacteria, as it were. So this evolutionary process goes incredibly rapidly, and with a bit of bad luck, which unfortunately we've had, resistance becomes very common if we're using antibiotics, as we've heard, inappropriately. We don't give them long enough, we don't give the right dose, and so on. And of course, sometimes even when we use them in the right dose, the bugs still can get resistant. So it's the villain of the piece. Yes, we have lots of problems with misuse of antibiotics and so on, and patients wanting them when they're not necessary, and that helps the bacteria that are lurking there to become resistant. But the villain of the piece really is the bacterium itself, in the sense that it's ready and waiting for us to throw antibiotics at it and then respond by throwing off these resistant types.
So this bacteria is essentially incredibly clever and is the real villain, but there seems to be that people need to take a personal responsibility as much as perhaps doctors need to when they are administering antibiotics, and also pharmaceutical industries. Now, if bacteria has become as clever as this and rapidly evolves as it has in the last 15, 20 years, why hasn't the pharmaceutical industries kept up pace with it?
I think it's done its best. And it is a very expensive thing to just do the research to find new antibiotics, and then, as we've heard, it takes many years to get even a successful new antibiotic that looks good in the laboratory, to get it tested. You've got to make sure it actually works. You've got to find out what it works on. You've got to find out what its dose is. Then you've got to test it for safety to make sure it doesn't have side effects in patients. And then you've got to roll it out in terms of making it commercially available and so on. And that takes many years. It's extremely expensive. And, pharmaceutical companies have been doing that for many years, but they're running out of targets to hit, new targets to hit. That is, new drugs that are going to be better than the ones we've got now. So we're and that's why Sally Davies, I think, Sally Davies is so worried about this, that she can't see these sort of saviors riding over the horizon to come in and knock all these resistant bacteria down because it's very unlikely to happen, and that's why she's so worried about antibiotic resistance.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. Are drug-resistant antibiotics as big a threat to society as terrorism? To discuss the issue, I'm joined by Hugh Pennington, Emeritus Professor of Bacteriology at Aberdeen University, Nick Breton, Head of Research at Benenden Healthcare, a private healthcare service, and Professor Mark Fielder, Director of Medical Veterinary and Food Microbiology at Kingston University. Professor Mark Fielder, then, do people have a responsibility then? You mentioned earlier about the countries where drugs are available over the counter. Which particular countries have a more liberal approach to administering antibiotics?
Well, there are various, and I think it would be a bit unfair to name and shame particularly, but we've certainly seen parts of the third world where this sort of practice has gone on. Various investigative journalism pieces have shown that that's the case, and that's where the evidence comes from about buying a single antibiotic. As far as the people's responsibility, I think we have a big one here, because there are many people that don't finish their course of antibiotics, and I think, as Professor Pennington says, the main problem here is the organism. The organism is the problem because that has this genetic availability and preparedness to change. But it's not because they're clever, as you described. They're not clever in the sense that we understand clever. What they are just doing is responding to their environment. We are giving them a hostile environment. We want them to go away. We want them to die. They are, as any biological entity will try and respond to that. And what they're doing by that response is making a series of essentially mistakes, some of which become beneficial, and those are the ones that survive. So we're essentially talking about evolution being forced by our use of antibiotics, because the organisms are not comfortable in us. It's a hostile environment. So when we are given antibiotics, we need to make sure that we do have the whole course, to make sure they have had the complete barrage, to try and minimise the possibility of them mutating, them becoming resistant to the drug in question.
But how if one person doesn't finish their course of antibiotics? How does that have a lasting effect on the global society?
Well, if you don't finish your course of antibiotics, and as Professor Pennington said, there is the possibility for resistance to start developing during the course of treatment, and if that scenario does come together, that organism then is not killed. That organism then might be transferred. We are talking about, after all, infectious disease, so that patient may pass that infection on. If they do, and it is difficult to treat in the next patient and so on in the next patient, then it spreads quite readily, potentially, because we can't kill it, or we don't have the initial treatments to be able to kill it. So the spread is quite easy. It won't necessarily go from one person to a global event, but it'll certainly start spreading in the communities first.
Nick Breton.
Yes, I think it's natural when people begin to feel better that they'll stop taking the medicine. And they may even be thinking that they're doing humankind a favour by not taking medicines that they feel they don't need. Now, clearly, that's a huge educational piece that people need to be told, look, you must finish the course, because if you don't, you're just damaging, you're not killing the bacteria, and actually, in a sense, what doesn't kill it strengthens it, perversely. So yes, that I'm sure has been a huge lack of awareness amongst the population as a whole, that they really must finish the course even if they are feeling better.
But why hasn't the message got through before, and why aren't people taking responsibility if they are being given antibiotics?
Well, perhaps people don't like considering illness, they don't like being ill, they don't like talking about illness, they don't particularly enjoy morbidity. And I think people would just like to stop taking things, many people, as soon as they possibly can.
But this seems to be a public health education that's
right.
needed.
That's right, especially if there may be some side effects from actually taking, some medicines, which are actually quite benign, but unwelcome. But yes, huge education piece, which is needed. It's not enough, I think, just the doctor or the pharmacist to say, or to print on the package that's given to you in the pharmacy, complete the course. I think there needs to be a much more thoroughgoing education piece to say why, and a big campaign is perhaps required, not just in the UK, but we know, because of the worldwide nature of the threat, across the entire world.
I think you make a very, very good point there. It's not just the fact that you shouldn't do it; it's the why you shouldn't do it. Because I think people haven't necessarily grasped that. It's a perceived and not perceived, an accepted wisdom with us in the business, so as to speak. But you do forget sometimes that people don't necessarily understand why you're saying what you say, so you need to get that message across.
Well, what do you think then the media have had a responsibility in the UK to project that message and haven't?
I don't think it's you refer to the UK. I don't think it's a UK only issue. I mean, this report obviously has come out here and has had a lot of press here, but we are talking about a global problem. So I think it's something we need to look at in every country, in every population, with all the media. It is a severe message that we need to get out to a lot of people to get people to realistically take their antibiotics or their medication for the course that they're prescribed and for the reasons as to why. I think if you get that whole message across to people, we might start to help the problem.
Absolutely.
Now, Professor Pennington, I don't know whether you can comment on the use of antibiotics in farm animals and their contribution to a growing resistance to drugs.
Yes, this is something, again, that Dame Sally Davies mentions in her report, that basically we have to, not just the human doctors, but the veterinarians also have a very important part to play, and farmers, because traditionally, for many years, animals have been given very small amounts of antibiotic in their feed to help them, because it makes them grow faster. We don't actually know why that is, but people discovered this, and now that practice is being phased out, but it's led to the development of resistant bacteria because, as we've been hearing, giving small doses of antibiotics for the wrong reason is a very bad thing, and this has happened in farm animals. And also, of course, there is a problem of treating animals that are sick and so on, and perhaps giving them antibiotics because they might get sick because they're all crowded together. You give them antibiotics, fear of the pigs or the cows or whatever it is fall ill. So there are all sorts of issues here about antibiotics, in a sense, not being used in the right sort of way, or rather being used in a way which helps bacteria, the resistant, the antibiotic-resistant ones, to become much commoner. So it has to be not just a human medicine problem that we're addressing, but also use of antibiotics in farm animals as well. And of course, at the end of the day, what happens is we don't necessarily get infected with the bugs that have become resistant in the farm animals, but what those bugs can do, they can swap their genes with bugs that are going to infect us, because bacteria, for example, live in the intestines of animals and live in the intestines of humans. We're sort of swapping them around. They don't necessarily cause us much harm, but their genes can move very easily because they can transfer their DNA from one bacterium to another, and their genes get transferred and their resistance genes get transferred. So these resistance genes, which are basically the way that the bacterium becomes resistant to the antibiotic, can move around just like the bacteria can. And this all goes on quite quietly, silently. We don't see it happening until we start to see resistant bacteria that are difficult to treat in human medicine, for example.
I think that highlights the terrorist effect, because we don't, as Professor Pennington says, it's going on, but we don't necessarily know exactly where and exactly what we're going to end up dealing with until it comes out. And of course that would be akin to a terrorist atrocity. Just to give a bit of good news, based around the veterinary aspect, I've actually been involved with a national veterinary practice doing a series of interviews and presentations to try and get their clientele, their farming clientele, to understand about treating animals with antibiotics, and trying to get the message exactly across that Professor Pennington was talking about. Rather than having to treat a whole herd or a whole flock, sometimes you can focus on treating an animal, because of course we have a welfare issue here. We can't blanketly remove all antibiotics from farming because there is a medical need or a clinical need for them to have antibiotics. If you've got a sick animal, you need to treat it. So perhaps focusing toward treating the animal that is unwell rather than blanket treating the whole herd, depending on what particular infection we're talking about. Sometimes that is necessary. But that message is starting to get across, and this veterinary company is actually now, or veterinary practice rather, is now producing these videos and making them freely available so that their clientele and other people can actually get that message too.
That's fine with treating sick animals, but what about the use of antibiotics as growth stimulants like ractopamine in pigs, and I think it's just pigs and chicken in the US, widely used in farming. And now Russia, for example, has banned the import of pork treated with ractopamine.
I don't know specifically about the US example, but I certainly know in the EU that the use of growth promoters has now been banned. So, as Professor Penton said, it's being phased out. It's generally a looked down upon practice. So
I understand it's still quite rife in the US, though.
Yeah, well, that's why I mentioned Europe as opposed to
Yes, I think in the US what they're trying to do is say, well, you can use it as long as the antibiotics are not ones that are going to be used in human medicine. But I think the approach that we're taking on this side of the Atlantic is a sounder one. Is just to phase it out altogether.
Completely agree.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. I'm joined by Hugh Pennington, Emeritus Professor of Bacteriology at Aberdeen University, Nick Breton, Head of Research for Benenden Healthcare, a private healthcare service, and Professor Mark Fielder, Director of Medical Veterinary and Food Microbiology at Kingston University. We've talked broadly about the threat of bacteria and bacteria as the villain. Just to go around the panel, what would you like anyone listening to this discussion to go away and really think about? I'll start with you, Nick Breton.
I think the real problem will lie if nothing is done. If we see decades more or even years more drift without some concerted, centralised activity, be it an awareness-raising campaign, an education campaign, or be it something a bit more penal, for instance, to discourage or penalise over-prescription or inappropriate prescription of antibiotics. Perhaps even bring in economic measures such as a tax on antibiotic use. And I think hospitals do need to examine themselves and check, are they absolutely as clean as they can be to prevent infection occurring in the first place.
Thank you, Nick. Now, Professor Hugh Pennington, finally from you. What is a greater threat, use of antibiotics in animals in the US as growth hormones, or the ticking time bomb bacteria villain that you spoke about?
Well, the example of the sort of problems we can run into is tuberculosis, where it's a question of rational use of the drugs that we know work, and they still do work, and it's a wonderful drug for treating tuberculosis. But in many parts of the world, the drugs have not been used wisely, resistant strains have appeared, and that, coupled with with HIV, has killed large numbers of people across the world because we haven't really focused on the scientific use of antibiotics. And that, of course, means restricting them when we need to restrict them, using them in combination, because if you use more than one at a time, say 3 antibiotics or 3 anti-tuberculous drugs, you stop these resistant bugs appearing. I think it'd be wrong to be optimistic that we will see off all the problems. There will be many, many infections will be able to go on being treated with antibiotics successfully. But unless we get this rational use and control in hospitals, control by general practitioners, control in the farming industry, this problem will continue and it will get worse.
Okay, finally from you, Professor Mark Fielder.
We need desperately to fill this discovery void. We need to get more research going. We need to get the public more involved and more engaged. And if I may plug a non-commercial website, there's a website called Antibiotic-Action, which is a website designed to inform people, both professionals and lay people, about the risks of antibiotic resistance. Taking everything the previous speakers have said together, along with filling the discovery void and having a look at the Antibiotic-Action website, will be a great help.
I'd like to thank all my guests, Nick Breton from Benenden Healthcare, Professor of Bacteriology Hugh Pennington, and Professor Mark Fielder, Director of Medical Veterinary and Food Microbiology at Kingston University.
That response runs out itself because the bacteria then get resistant to the next antibiotics. And, the worry is that sooner or later, and as Dame Sally Davies has been saying, we may run out of antibiotics altogether, at least for some bugs. So different bugs behave in different ways, but some get resistance very quickly, some take a longer time. Most of them do get resistant eventually. But the problem about developing new antibiotics, as she says in her big report that came out a week or two back, was that it's really quite difficult. And there are 2 big reasons for that, and she focuses on one, which is it's not actually terribly good business for...
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. 25,000 people in the European Union die because their body can't reject a serious bacterial infection with antibiotics. England's chief medical officer has come out and said the threat antibiotic-resistant bacteria poses is as great a threat to the UK as terrorism. Professor Dame Sally Davies described it as a ticking time bomb and has called for urgent...
We've got here is a situation where we always hoped and thought it would carry on and our treatments would just get better. What we've had to realise is that as treatments have been more rapidly and more readily used, we're now in a situation where resistance has occurred and we really need to deal with it now. It's in our faces, so as to speak.
Professor Pennington, we'll deal then with what Dame Sally Davies has said, and then I'll come on to asking you how bacteria has become so clever.
Yes, Dame Sally Davies is right that we in the past we have got a resistant bacterium appearing, and then we've been able to throw a new antibiotic at it and sort the problem out. The trouble is that
put it out there is as big a threat as terrorism is.
It is a big a threat as terrorism because we don't exactly know when the next resistance problem is going to occur. We know that a resistance problem will occur, but exactly when and where is somewhat a mystery. So therefore it's like terrorism in the sense that we know it's there, we just don't know exactly where it is. One of the problems we've got, certainly with modern medicine, is that we are very, very used to being able to be treated for infectious diseases. So there is an expectation on part of the medical fraternity to be able to treat, and us as the populace to be treated. So taking that together, I think what we got...
And action worldwide to tackle the issue. But antibiotic resistance was the focus on World Health Day in 2011 in Moscow. So what's being done now to fight drug-resistant bacteria? To discuss the issue, I'm joined by Professor Mark Fielder, Director of Medical Veterinary and Food Microbiology at Kingston University, Hugh Pennington, Emeritus Professor of Bacteriology at Aberdeen University, Nick Breton, Head of Research for Benenden Healthcare, a private healthcare service. I'll begin by asking Professor Mark Fielder in the studio here, why has it taken until 2013 for this message to get through again? And is Dame Sally Davies right to